Venkat. Okay. Good afternoon. I don't know if it's ready. Just read the microphone. Can you hear me? Yeah. Welcome to this second activity promoted by the Germanet Chair of the Culture of European Integration. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Venkat from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It's my great pleasure for several reasons, some which are very important in personal terms, and I am not going to deal with them today, but and that's the reason why he's here. Some other very important in academic terms. It's a person whom I admire. I insist both in personal and in academic terms. So much so that that's not quite common in academia to have a splendid person both personally and intellectually and academically. Professor Venkat is associate professor at Wisconsin-Madison, as I have said, at the Department of German. But his research and his teaching goes well beyond the field of German studies, where he, for example, specializes in the study of minorities within German literature, the relationships between Turkish literature and German literature. It goes well beyond the field of German studies because, for example, you can see that in the different centers he is an affiliate faculty. Like, for example, the Center for German and European Studies, the Global Studies Center, the Center for South Asia Studies, Women and Gender Studies. He spent quite recently a year at the University of Leipzig with a research which was funded by the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, and you know very well how prestigious this foundation is, and this is very telling in relation to Professor Mani's research. His research workshop on world literature has received the Andrew Mellon Award because of the importance of the activities that are carried out at this research workshop. I think it's very important today for our school and for our university to have Professor Venkat here, because he is one of the leading scholars working on world literature. His last book is titled Cosmopolitical Claims, Turkish-German Literatures from Nardoni to Pamuk, and he's now working on another manuscript. Some of us know part of these manuscripts, are looking forward to having it as a published book, and seeing the impact it's going to have on research. His talk today is titled A Pact with Books, Measuring the World with Literature, and it's, I assume, one of his presentations which deals with one of the defining features of world literature, as it has been defined by several scholars, namely the issue of circulation. Circulation has been defined for example, by David Ambrose in What is World Literature in 2003, as the fact that some literary works belong to world literature because they circulate beyond their culture of origin. I think some scholars have some problems with this definition, in the sense that it is obvious that books don't circulate by themselves, and we have to take into consideration the issue of agency. If books circulate and are translated, is because of several facts, and many of them have nothing to do with aesthetic or literary values per se. As a matter of fact, Professor Mani has coined the term of bibliomigration, which can be translated as the migración de los libros. So we can think as there is not only a migration of people, but also a migration of books, and in the same way as people face many difficulties when migrating, books face similar difficulties as well. As I told you, the title of his presentation is A Pact with Books, Measuring the World with Literature. And as you can see, we have quite a small group of people here, but I can assure you that they are the best. And they are the best because they are my students from several courses, from second year BA students to MA students and doctoral students. So all the levels are represented here, and I think that after the presentation we can have some time for questions, comment and discussions. Thank you very much for being here, Venkat.
Thank you, Cesar. Thank you. Let me start by saying you all can hear me, right? Excellent. I want to thank you, first of all, for this very, very kind introduction. And I'm very thankful to you also for this invitation to come here to Santiago de Compostela. I've been admiring the work, and I mean it in the most sincere terms, that Cesar has been doing, both in terms of pedagogy here at USC, but also in terms of his research on world literature, which has been extremely crucial, and you will see it as the paper unfolds. How this entire book that I'm working on, which is called A Pact with Books, the book is called Borrowing Privileges, World Literature and Germany's Pact with Books. The period it covers is between 1800 and 2010, and it covers sort of 200 years of library history, print cultural history, following this notion of circulation. And I consider this an extended conversation with Cesar's own very important work on world literature, and especially opening up the political currency of the idea of circulation for us. So it's a pleasure and an honor to be here, and of course it's a pleasure and an honor to be among the best of the students, and I really thank you for coming. I know it must have been a long day for you, and so thank you for taking time. I'm going to be speaking for about 45 minutes, and during these 45 minutes, if at some point of time I feel that the presentation is dragging or we're not having fun, I might skip some parts and we can start, a conversation. But you're more than welcome to ask questions at the very end, and sometimes I feel that the whole point of presenting your current research is to get good questions. So any questions are very welcome. Feel free to ask. I'll try to answer them both from my work, and if I haven't thought about those questions, I'll obviously be very thankful to you. So without further ado, let's start having some fun, and I want to show you a few websites. So let me try this. Let me go here first. So, Chinese translation of James Joyce becomes a bestseller, ran the headline of a story on BBC News in January 2013. Translated by Dai Kong Ron, Professor of Chinese Language and Literature at the Fudan University, Joyce's Finnegan's Wake was published last year by Shanghai's People's Publishing House. Finnegan's Wake, which was promoted on, and I quote, a series of billboards across Shanghai and Beijing, reportedly a first for China, end quote, was an immense success. The initial print run of 8,000 copies sold out within a month, and there are more copies that are being sold, and it's not just university people who are buying these copies. Pamuk adds spark to Jaipur Literary Festival brawl, reported the Kolkata-based Indian daily The Telegraph in February 2011. The Jaipur Literary Festival, which now enjoys the status of being the largest literary festival in the Asia Pacific, was hosting the Turkish Nobel laureate Orhan Pamuk for the first time. Newspapers and television in India declared Pamuk the main draw of the festival. And if Oprah Winfrey is any measure of public coverage, Oprah Winfrey was in India right after, in 2012, and Orhan Pamuk got more press than Oprah Winfrey. So you can see what a spark it created. Next we come to Roberto Bolaño. James Dean war er nicht. He wasn't James Dean, was how the German weekly Die Zeit referred to the Chilean exile novelist Roberto Bolaño. Bolaño's 2666, which was published in the Spanish original in 2004, shortly after Bolaño's death, became a super hit in several countries. In the US, where the English translation by Natasha Wimmer won the Best Novel of the Year as well as the Penn Prize for Best Translation, the New York Times reported, and I quote, "By writing across the grain of his doubts about what literature can do, how much it can discover, Bolaño has proven it, as in literature, can do anything." And one of the most talked about literary events of the 21st century was the publication of 1Q84 by the Japanese novelist Haruki Murakami. The novel was received with enthusiasm both at home and abroad. It had become a bestseller in Japan even before it was published, so the first run had to be considerably expanded. Murakami, who translated F. Scott Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby into Japanese, recently published Colorless Tsukuru Tazaki and His Years of Pilgrimage. Japanese readers lined up in front of stores all night before the release of the novel, and fans around the world are waiting for translation in their first languages. These are just 4 instances from the vast world of literature from the first decade of the 21st century. To a skeptic, these examples might appear as anomalies in the general neglect of literature in a world where entertainment is governed by film, television, and the internet. Some scholars might attribute these events to the popularity and portability of the novel as genre and nothing else. Comparative literary purists might use these events to criticize the nexus between market forces, media, and the ever-rising consumerist approach to world literature and translation. That is, yet another excuse not to learn a foreign language. But that's not the case. That's one of the points that I'm trying to make in this paper. However, a look at the Facebook pages of these authors, and see, Bolaño is dead, but his Facebook page lives, obviously hosted by the publisher. A look at the Facebook pages of these authors and their worldwide following reveals a global public's enthusiasm for literature. Links are posted, comments are shared, author readings are publicized, not in Roberto Bolaño's case, obviously he's not alive. But when the author status is updated, usually by the publishing company, by posting quotes from the author's works, for example, within minutes, hundreds of thousands of people around the world like and comment on the updated status. What these examples reveal is that despite severe competition from other media, literature seems to be thriving, and there's a vital and exciting public life of literature. These examples illustrate how the globalizing world economy is working in tandem with technological advances of the 21st century. With access to information about distant places of the world at lightning speed through the internet, access to books through libraries and online book vendors, availability of electronic reading devices such as Kindle and Nook, readerships of literary works are expanding beyond the point of their geocultural origins. And Cesar was writing, pointing out that, I'm working on the idea of circulation. Let me interrupt myself and say what I'm interested in is not that works circulate, but how they circulate. And this migration, much like human migration, and I'm going to show, is both willful and forced. Human migration is not of one kind, it has many shades, and migration of books, migration of texts is also willful and forced. So this is all willful. This is the happy story that I'm telling you before I get you into the darker corners of circulation. So, large-scale migration of people from one part of the world to another is further adding to more exposure to and more interest in literary and cultural products of nations that are not homelands in the traditional sense. Unlike half a century ago, when circulation of literature in the world was conceived in terms of Western centers and non-Western peripheries, today the circulation is multidirectional, multidimensional, and multilingual. Shanghai, Tokyo, Istanbul, and Jaipur are renegotiating their position as centers of world literary circulation. An Irish author is popular with the Chinese, a Turk with the Indians, a Chilean author with Americans and Germans, a Japanese author is ratcheting sentiments of readers around the world. Ours is an exciting time for world literature. Ours is an exciting time for world literature and translation. And a renewed pact with books is at the center of this excitement. No discussion on world literature. These are the various centers that I wanted to show you. That this is not just, it's not just a story around the United States or around Europe. Now, various centers are emerging. And let's start. Let's keep it here. No discussion of the term world literature can be carried out in the absence of the world in which the literature emanates. The world itself is a multivalent signifier marked by geographical features, political boundaries, cultural specificities, historical processes, and financial realities. The imagination, conceptualization, and proliferation of the term world literature is therefore not to be dissociated with any of these forces. In fact, the process of initialization and institutionalization of world literature are in direct and intimate connection with the world in which the human creative and intellectual endeavor takes place. Discussions of world literature from its very well-known documented inception in the Western European literary sphere in the first half of the 19th century all the way to current discussions in the first half of the 20th century must therefore be framed and understood in terms of the political, historical, and sociocultural and economic realities of the world in which these discussions emanated. And this is the task that I want to undertake in this presentation. In the discussion that follows, I want us to think through the public sphere construction of world literature through a triangulation of the following institutions: libraries, print cultural industry, and sponsored translation initiatives. The construction of world literature, I want to emphasize, happens in tandem with the construction of a world literary reading public. And more often than not, this reading public is created in translation. It's a translated reading public, whereby market forces as well as political ideologies play a very important role. Consideration of the material history of the book, the physicality of the book, the charting of the transformations of library and print culture opens up world literature, I want to argue, to new modes of inquiry. Literary propriety, systems of patronage of translation, class-based affiliations, and accessibility through literacy, publications, and library acquisition become crucial to the circulation and propagation of world literature. But before undertaking a systematic investigation of how material access becomes significant in the history of world literature, let us look at the most important states in current conceptualizations of world literature. These states are both aesthetic and political, and they find resonance from the early 19th century to the present. Some of the current debates, and I'll be commenting on them towards the end of my presentation. But in order to understand these states, we must locate world literature within a modern history of ideas. This will help to understand how world literature becomes the source of aesthetic evaluation of the world and the construction of the world which is encoded in literature. How world literature becomes a unit of measuring the world, and that happens through a pact of books. What are the benefits of examining the construction of world literature in translation in conjunction with the world in which literature is created, circulated, and collated? What role do libraries, print culture industry, and special interest groups play in the institutionalization of world literature? And finally, how does world literature in translation become a measure of the world when a pact with books undergoes renewal? To approach these questions, let me take you back to the early 19th century. How many of you know this novel? Measuring the World. Highly entertaining. I'll get to that. Daniel Kahneman's international bestseller, Measuring the World, 2007, this is the translation published in 2007, narrates the quest for knowledge through the lives of two giants of the 19th century, the botanist and geographer Alexander von Humboldt and the mathematician and physicist Carl Friedrich Gauss. Gauss's travels are in a virtual space. His passion for exactitude draws him to work on the laws of quadratic reciprocity and frequency of prime numbers. Quote, this is Gauss. At the base of physics were rules, at the base of rules there were laws, at the base of laws there were numbers, end quote. Humboldt's quest for scientific knowledge would take him to the geographical New World. With permission from the officers of the Spanish colonial regime in Madrid, in 1799, Humboldt arrives in New Amsterdam, Trinidad, to begin with what will be recorded in history as one of the most important explorations of all times. Soon after his arrival in this novel, in the fictionalized story of Humboldt that derives from Humboldt's autobiographical writings, but also from the scholarship around him. So Humboldt visits a Christian mission in New Amsterdam, which is set up to baptize the natives. The monks, they're all baffled. What is this German doing here? The monks cannot figure out what Humboldt and his companion Bonpland want of them. The abbot expresses his suspicion thusly, and I quote, "Nobody traveled halfway around the world to measure land that didn't even belong to him," end quote. Kahneman does not give much print cultural space to Alexander's older brother, Wilhelm von Humboldt, who was pursuing his quest for exact knowledge, albeit through ancient languages. While the novel mentions, and I quote again, by 13 he, as in Wilhelm, had mastered 2 languages, by 14 4, by 15 7, end quote, and references his meetings with authors such as Goethe and Wieland, Wilhelm remains a background figure. However, apart from Greek and Latin, Wilhelm von Humboldt was competent in Sanskrit, Chinese, and Japanese, and was working on theories of comparative linguistics and grammatical forms. Along with translations of Pindar's Olympic Odes and Achilles' Agamemnon, Wilhelm von Humboldt was translating the Bhagavad Gita from Sanskrit into Latin, which would be published in 1820. Unlike Alexander, Wilhelm did not have to travel afar. His access to literature and languages of faraway lands was made possible through the libraries in Paris. French and British colonial presence in Asia and parts of Northern Africa was initiating and facilitating the arrival of many works of literature to Europe in their original languages and in translations. Along with the geographical, botanical, zoological, physical, and chemical mapping of the world, a literary map of the world was being developed. Intersections of aesthetic forms, selection of subject matters and their treatment, and affinities between modes of creative expression were already being carried out piecemeal among literatures on the European continent. The canvas, this is the end of the 18th, early 19th century, the canvas was now being enlarged with increased access to literatures from other geolinguistic spaces. In other words, through acquisition of languages, translation of literary works, and constructions of rules of grammar, Wilhelm von Humboldt was also finding ways of measuring parts of the world that did not belong to him by birth or by inheritance. Measuring the World, the novel, captures a historical turning point when European acquisition of knowledge about the world is undergoing a drastic change. The idea of the New World, in its history and contemporaneity, becomes an object of fascination and exploration. The travelogue, which had long served as a major source of knowledge about the world in past centuries, still found validation. What is new is the privileging of a different kind of travel narrative that was not merely about impressions, but about knowledge, evaluated, tested, scientifically exact knowledge. The world, be it in its metaphysical, epistemological, ontological, or physical form, was now being accessed through scientific treaties, documents, maps, etc. And this is the part where I'm locating it also in sort of what happens with this modern notion of world literature, because world literature also exists in many, many different forms. It's not just exclusive to the modern era. But something new happens even in discussions of world literature, starting in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, and that's where I'm sort of intellectually trying to locate this moment. So new developments in science and technology: John Campbell's invention of the sextant, 1757, John Harrison's marine chronometer, 1761, Alessandro Volta's invention of the battery, 1800, all the way to Friedrich Koenig's improvement on the printing press, 1810, exemplify the vital energy that characterized the dawn of a speedier age. The launching of several encyclopedias: Diderot's Encyclopédie, 1751, Encyclopedia Britannica, 1768, which expanded to 20 volumes by 1810, Renatus Gotthelf Löbel and Christian Wilhelm Francke's Konversationslexikon, 1796, which becomes the Brockhaus Encyclopédie in 1808, were part of the collection, collation, classification, and organization of knowledge about the world. In other words, in the late 18th and early 19th century, textual knowledge becomes key to grasping a world beyond one's physical reach. And since I started, I'll take a little break and talk to you for a minute. Since I started with all of these developments in Facebook, and if you look at the moment now, and if you compare it with the moment in the early 19th century, I'm hoping that we'll start seeing some intersections, if not similarities. That the sense of high technology that we have right now, that all of us have access to. Now there's a difference in public sphere creation of scientific achievements and public sphere creation of literature. But think about, we look back, step back and think about these two ages in comparison, we might be able to see why we are getting excited about world literature. And it's not just, technology is one of the bits, it's not just because of technology, there are political factors as well. But politically too, colonialism, imperialism is bringing all of these texts from non-European locations into Europe. And literature starts getting exported in a much faster pace into the colonies as well. And I can get into that history. Some of it is forced, but I can get into that history during the Q&A. It would be a fallacy indeed to assume that the growth of knowledge and support to quench the curiosity about the world happened in a vacuum. The growing trade between Asian and European nations gave birth to the idea of world trade, Welthandel, and world market, Weltmarkt, to designate international exchange of goods and international traffic of capital. This growing mercantilism, which led eventually to the establishment of colonial regimes, facilitated access to geographical and historical knowledge about different parts of the world. A sense of comparative world history was developing. Leading intellectuals and thinkers, especially in Germany, such as Immanuel Kant, Johann Gottfried Herder, and G.W. Hegel, were all developing their own modalities of Weltgeschichte, world history. Let it be noted that the comparative modalities of world history were in turn based on new historical sources. Tarikh-e-Farishta, translated into English by Alexander Dow, available in German translation in 1773, Johann Joachim Schwabe and Javier Feigel's historical accounts of South America, Simon Barrington and John Knack's translation from Italian of Di Luca's journeys in North Africa, and Karl Diepmann and Johann Heymann's accounts of French colonies in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. So this is the body of works that is being translated, printed, available, at least to the scholars. It is in this transformative moment that works of literature, especially from European colonies in Asian and Latin American countries, start making their way into the European literary space. A select number of these literary works, already famous in the places of their origin, and that being famous also has a longer history, which I'm not going to perform today, acquired many readers in Europe. Translated by important authors, vetted by figures who had significant influence over the European literary sphere, these works were received with great enthusiasm in Europe. But apart from these most famous titles, there were countless others, lesser-known works too, that were crossing boundaries on land and sea, entering other geolinguistic spaces, and finding readerships beyond their points of origin. While an intra-European circulation of literature in translation and in original languages of Europe was already in place, an extra-European traffic of books was growing at an unprecedented rate. The idea of world literature, in other words, was taking shape. And very quickly, this idea transforms from being just an impression of a faraway world, it becomes a space of evaluating, testing, understanding, and measuring it with all the tools of literary criticism available. This is where world literature becomes part of measuring of the world, which did not belong to the measurer. And one did not have to travel halfway across the world to do it. Books were delivered quite literally to one's doorstep, especially in Europe. Among German intellectuals, these are some of the words, sorry I missed this. Among German intellectuals, the idea of world literature becomes an integral part of Enlightenment theories of cosmopolitanism and universalism on the one hand, and attempts to measure the world and its enlightened reader on the other. As Johann Peter Eckermann documented in his Gespräche mit Goethe, Conversations with Goethe, published 1836, Goethe highlighted the term Weltliteratur, anticipating the arrival of the epoch of world literature through an engagement with that which is not one's own, the strange, the foreign. Goethe was not the first German intellectual to use the term. In one of the first uses of the word, in 1801, Christoph Martin Wieland placed Weltliteratur, the term Weltliteratur, in the Urbanität of Rome, connecting it with the character building and well-being that is derived from reading the best authors and from interactions with the most cultivated and exquisite persons in a sophisticated time period. Wieland's concept of world literature is closely tied to the world citizen, whose great familiarity with world literature actually cultivates the world citizenship. August Wilhelm Schlegel's use of the term in his lectures on the literary history in Berlin, 1801-1803, is in the service of a progressive Universalpoesie. But in fact, months prior to Goethe's use of the term, a literary magazine, Literarisches Konversationsblatt, later Blätter für literarische Unterhaltung, had already circulated the term in the public sphere in an anonymous review of the German translation of James Fenimore Cooper's novel The Prairie, panning the book and declaring that Cooper was no Walter Scott. And this is a very interesting review that I discovered completely by accident when I was looking up the literary construction of public sphere in Leipzig in 2011. And let me also tell you that I arrived in Leipzig sort of prepared with my laptop and with my iPad, and the first thing that I had to buy was a magnifying glass to be able to read 19th century magazines, especially because they were not digitized, I mean the ones that I was looking at. And that sort of also puts you in perspective that research tools are not always the ones that you think you should have. And those hours of just flipping through these literary magazines was very rewarding, because this is one of the discoveries. And this review, which I'm citing heavily in my first chapter, actually shows that how there was already a parallel discussion of construction of world literature as well. And that was meant for readers through these Enlightenment literary magazines. They were not always, we cannot say that this was a great democratic moment, because literacy was also limited. but at the same time, there is an attempt at least to go beyond the university classroom, which is something that I'll discuss at the very end. Anyway, nonetheless, what distinguishes Goethe's statement is its direct reference to a non-European work. In Eckermann's entry from 31st of January 1827, Goethe remarks that he's currently reading a chinesischer Roman, a Chinese novel, whose title remains unmentioned. Goethe's access to Chinese literary works reveals a large network of works from Asia entering the European space in the 18th and 19th centuries, whereby translators, publishing houses, and libraries play a very significant role. Goethe's Bibliothek Katalog 1958, the comprehensive catalogue of Goethe National Library in Weimar, includes holdings from Goethe's private library as well as his father's library, and this documents titles of literary works in 20 languages in original or translation that Goethe had acquired during his lifetime. Non-European works include Georg Forster's translation of Kalidasa's Shakuntala, 1791, Karl Wilhelm von Humboldt's Bhagavad Gita, 1826, Joseph von Hammer-Purgstall's translation from Persian into German of Shamsuddin Hafiz's Poetic Divan, 1812-1813, with which Goethe engaged in his own Westöstliche Divan, 1814-19. The catalogue does not mention a single work of Chinese literature in original or in translation. However, it was a library of the Großherzogliche Haus Sachsen-Weimar, the Grand Duchy of Saxony-Weimar, to the Die Klassik-Stiftung Weimar, that made Goethe's access to Chinese literature possible. This brief glimpse into Goethe's library excuse me, serves more than a descriptive function. It assists in highlighting how at the height of European colonialism in the 19th century, many literary works entered the global traffic of literature. With readerships beyond their points of origin, whether in original languages of their composition or in translations and adaptations, these narratives came to be recognized as Weltliteratur. These works also became the cornerstone for literary comparison. Just look at Goethe's moment. Providing an alternative to the national literary arrangement of texts. In his own statement, Goethe offers a compact and succinct examination of Weltliteratur, pitting it against Nationalliteratur, national literature. And Goethe extends his humanistic thought as he offers it as a shared literary heritage of human beings. Goethe asserts poetry is the shared property, Gemeingut, of humankind. Goethe establishes Weltliteratur as a philosophical, humanistic ideal, as a mode of transnational arrangement of texts. However, this ideal remains prospective, and the pedagogical implications remain largely dispersed among the general reading public. The age of world literature is at hand, Goethe states, and insinuates that it will be replacing national literature, albeit not as an academic discipline. If Goethe privileges the conceptual, ideational dimension of world literature, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels first acknowledged the coming of age of Weltliteratur by locating it in the material history of the 19th century. In the Manifest der Kommunistischen Partei, first published in London in 1848, Marx and Engels stipulate the material conditions of hastening of the approach of world literature through the spread of bourgeois capital. Not unlike Goethe, for Marx and Engels too, literature emerges as the shared property, the Gemeingut of humankind. However, they highlight the Gut, the wares, the material artifact in the word Gemeingut, and credit the emergence of the term to rise in a cosmopolitan consumption that assures through a worldwide circulation of books and literature, along with transnational trade. Outlining the cultural consequences of the financial interdependence of nations, Marx and Engels describe the emergence of world literature out of many national literatures. And now I'm getting to the phase where I start actually following this process of circulation after this introduction. And I'm going to be now focusing on sponsored translation enterprises. Preparations for Goethe's statement begin in the early 19th century with a new idea of the world and a new idea of the world in print accessible to European readers. Not yet a unified nation as Britain and France, not an established colonial power as Britain, France, Spain, or Portugal, Germany becomes a major beneficiary of translation enterprise initiated and facilitated by colonialism. There is an unprecedented mass acquisition of Asian texts in German libraries, royal, university, and those belonging to private intellectuals. The Sanskrit mania, this is Amir Mufti's term, the Sanskrit mania that begins with George Foster's translation in 1791 from William Jones's translation into English of Kalidasa's Shakuntala acquires new dimensions in the decades following its publication. In addition to the acquisition of manuscripts and publication of translations into German, royal libraries, university libraries, as well as intellectual societies and individuals become subscribers of this one institution that I'm going to talk about, which is the Oriental Translation Fund. Two moments that I'm not discussing, but I think I should mention it to you. I haven't translated them into German, into English, or into Spanish, because my Spanish is non-existent, I'm sorry. But this is an article published by an anonymous author, and this is also in the Literarisches Konversationsblatt, this literary magazine that I was talking to you about. And this is a piece called Bücher und Büchervermehrung, Books and Expansion of Books. And this is from 1822, and it's categorically talking about how we will have to, how there is this is an unprecedented moment of the expansion of both the book market, but also a great opportunity for the libraries to rethink their organization of books. And the statement is very, very political. It says that, you know, new spaces are opening up, talks about different parts of the world, you know, except for Europe will have a great part in the expansion of this Bücherreich, in this empire of books that is being created. The literature of North America is becoming more and more important, and in the European colonies, there is a movement. In the European colonies around the world, there is this blooming of literature which will actually have its impact on European book market, or the empire of books. This is one moment, and the second moment is from 1790, it's the end of the 18th century, and this is Immanuel Kant's essay to his publisher Friedrich Nicolai, where he's talking about bookmaking as an important part of culture. And this is once again a comment on the physicality of books that I'm trying to follow, that these were moments when there was on the one hand this major acquisition of works from Europe and not North America, but from Asia and parts of Northern Africa, but there was within Germany a sense that something is changing in the book market. Anyway, this is the translation of Kalidasa's Shakuntala that I mentioned, and now we come to the Oriental Translation Fund, which was established in 1828. The Oriental Translation Fund was set up in 1828 with a, quote, plan for translating and publishing interesting and valuable works on Eastern history, science, and belles lettres, as still are in manuscript, in the libraries of the universities, the British Museum, and the East India House, and in other collections in Asia and Africa, as well as Europe, for providing funds to carry this object into execution, end quote. The administrative structure of the committee reflects the nexus between aristocratic, academic, and colonial elites. It also embodied the global scale and scope of the plan. While King George IV was listed as the primary patron, vice patrons included, among others, Dukes of Clarence, Sussex and Wellington, Archbishops of Canterbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Chancellors of Universities of Oxford and Cambridge, among others. Overseas vice patrons included Lord William Bentinck, at that time the Governor-General of India, governors of the presidencies of Bombay, Ceylon and Madras, and H.T. Colebrook, at that time the director of the Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and Ireland. The committee itself was globally constituted, and I'm using the same maps, if you've been following this, you know, the same image, just refocusing the points, to also tell us what were considered sort of the centers of world literature, what is becoming now, and in these intermediate periods, what other cities all of a sudden emerged in this global network of translation. The committee itself was globally constituted with representatives from professors of Hebrew, Arabic, Sanskrit, Hindustani, and Oriental languages and history, both in England and in cities as far-flung as Aberdeen, Alexandria, Colombo, Calcutta, Corfu, Bombay, Madras, Tehran, Tunis, and Singapore, to name just a few. The first report lists about 100 subscribers, which range from individuals, mostly nobility, to all major libraries in England, literary societies of major cities and British colonies, as well as the Asiatic Society in Calcutta. Even by today's standards, the endeavor was impressively multinational. However, it's not merely the globality of the enterprise, but its aim and scope that makes it worthy of consideration even in the contemporary context. The committee positions itself transnationally, promising to act as a liaison between British centers of learning, which those in the colonies, and appoints itself to make Eastern literature accessible to the public. The prospectus of the committee from 1828, which is coincidentally 1827, December 31, 1827 is when Goethe makes a statement on world literature, and this prospectus is from 1828, explicitly mentions the significance of public accessibility of literary and scholarly works. The very first point of the prospectus underscores how the committee's goal is to explore ways through which, I think I have the quote here, it is possible through which, quote, the public may be put in possession of all that is valuable in Eastern literature and an opportunity be presented for showing that this country is not at present backward in contributing the advancement of Oriental studies, which she has long held the foremost rank. So you can see both sort of the noblesse oblige, right? That we want to promote these literatures, but we want to do it because England as a country has their, is in a position to do that, and we want to show that we care about this culture. Well, if you've read Edward Said's Orientalism, you know that there's a connection between this power and creation of knowledge. And this is sort of the dichotomy of these situations that also must be taken into account when considering this idea of circulation. Circulation is politically charged and historically conditioned, much like the idea of world literature itself. So, the results of this endeavor are consequently promised for both England and its Eastern possessions, right? Categorically using the word Eastern possessions. So books become as much part of possession as the countries or the cultures themselves. And I quote again, sorry, let me actually take back and read this line because this is kind of interesting. The results of this endeavor are consequently promised for both England and its Eastern possessions, productive for the good of both the governors and the governed. So there is a clear sense that there is a governed public and there are some governors, and the governors are actually creating, facilitating the flow of this literature. The legislative source and executive force of the last quotes attest the power of the Oriental discourse as described by Edward Said and numerous publications thereafter. What is equally remarkable and must be noted is the idea of the Gemeingut, the shared or common property, which appears in the prospectus to qualify literary works. Texts, when converted from manuscripts to mass-published books, in original or in translation, acquire their dual role as intellectual and material artifacts. And here is a list, I'm not going to read it. This is the network that I was showing you. And here is a list of books that were first published, or at least a list from the first list of books that were first published, translated and published by the Oriental Translation Funds. And the last three works, mostly from Farsi, represent the belles lettres, the creative fiction. But this belles lettres, these works, as you will find today, do not make it to the canons of world literature. So that canon also changes, as times change. Shakuntala still exists. What is to be noted as by the time the second report comes out, it includes translations of two literary works classified as romances from Chinese, and the third report lists over 50 works in 3 categories in 6 languages. So, for a time like this, I think with the expansion that is taking place, it's quite remarkable what they wanted to accomplish. If the first half of the 19th century witnesses a selective, albeit concentrated effort in the entry of literatures from non-European languages into the German-speaking sphere, by the second half of the 19th century, these efforts systematize themselves. First, and this is the German story, first there is a rise in the number of direct translations into German from Sanskrit, Arabic, Chinese, Persian, and later even Japanese. English and French slowly lose their status as intermediary languages. Second, there is a concentrated effort to institutionalize research and education in non-European languages and literatures. The pioneering efforts of Friedrich Schlegel, Franz Bopp, Wilhelm von Humboldt culminate in the founding of the Deutsche Morgenländische Gesellschaft, the German Oriental Society, in 1844, a society that also establishes the first specialized library for non-European manuscripts and books, printed books, in Halle. Halle's geographical proximity to Leipzig, which was considered to be Bücherstadt, the city of books, was an added advantage. In the 19th century, Leipzig was unquestionably the major Buchstadt Leipzig, the book city, with over 200 small and large publishers and bookstores. It was also the city where Hermann Brockhaus, heir to the Brockhaus print empire and professor of Sanskrit at the University of Leipzig, would found his seat and would make first suggestions for printing non-European works, especially from Sanskrit, Prakrit, and Hindi in the Latin script. So you can see, books do not just travel on their own. You have to have institutions, individuals, systems of patronage, and mechanisms for circulation in order for circulation to actually take place. The Society's report, and this is the Deutsche Morgenländische Gesellschaft, the Society's report from the first years of its founding made frequent mentions of libraries in Leiden, Berlin, Paris, and London who were prominently acquiring books and manuscripts from Asia. Akin to the British Oriental Translation Fund, the Morgenländische Gesellschaft was part of an international network of scholars and librarians. The members of the society included translators such as Ritter from Hammer-Purgstall and Friedrich Druckert. The society depended upon its Prussian diplomatic missions in Jordan, Turkey, and Lebanon, among others, for acquisition of manuscripts in Arabic, Persian, Chuktai Turkish, and Ottoman Turkish. In addition, the society had close connections with Christian religious missionaries in Halle, who in turn were connected to Danish missionaries, to acquire manuscripts and printed books from the Indian subcontinent, and especially southern India. And in 1847, the Society's annual report lists 10 manuscripts and over 20 printed works acquired from India by University of Tübingen. And these are some of the books. These are manuscripts from the Mackenzie collection at the Madras Christian College, which then found their way to German libraries. And I'm now going to tell you about a book thief, and after that I'll move to contemporary scholarship, and then we're getting close to the end of the presentation. Are you having a good time so far? Okay. By the late 1840s, a corresponding member of the society became the most outstanding, and perhaps the most controversial link between the society, between the Deutsche Morgenländische Gesellschaft and the Oriental Translation Fund. This person was Alois Sprenger, 1813 to 1893, an Austrian-born Orientalist and doctor of medicine who first went to India in 1843 and in 1845 was appointed the principal of the prestigious Delhi College in Delhi. In 1848, Sprenger was sent to the northern Indian city of Lucknow. Let me just show you where this is. So we're talking, right, you can see Lucknow in northern India. I hope you can read it, right? Okay, since it's being recorded and it's going to be posted, internet always puts you in a precarious situation. I have to say that nobody has been able to to either demonstrate or at least hasn't been interested in whether Alois Sprenger could be a book thief. Maybe there's an Alois Sprenger society somewhere who's ready to sue me. But there is a discrepancy in the historical connection as to how he acquires all of these books in India, transports them. It's a huge collection of books, shipment that comes to Europe. He handles with a few universities, and then ends up selling it to Staatsbibliothek in Berlin. Right? But it's around the same time that he sort of stops working for the British government, and it's in the second part of his catalogue, which is decidedly different from the first part, where he talks about books as if he acquired them, but he acquired them because he had to save them. And there's some discrepancy in the narrative, which I have not been able to understand. And so I think there was some hanky-panky going on, which nobody has been able to. But I'll tell you the story and you can decide it for yourself. Okay, so in 1848 he was sent to the northern Indian city of Lucknow to catalogue Farsi, Arabic and Urdu collections of the libraries of the Kingdom of Awadh. In 1848, Sprenger sent a letter to the Morgenländische Gesellschaft reporting on the state of literature in British India. The letter bears uncanny resemblance to the prospectus of the Oriental Translation Fund. And I quote, "It has been almost 100 years since the British, the locomotors of European education and its developments outside, have been ruling India and working on the intellectual rebirth of this wonderful country. Their efforts and the creative power of the conditions in which India has entered through English rule has already had great effects." End quote. Sprenger lists among these achievements the immense number of magazines that are now being published in India in indigenous languages. Delhi, he reports, has 6 political magazines published weekly, 2 of which have a section on literature, and 1 that is a literary monthly. And he goes on and on. He lists the languages in which these and other magazines are published: Farsi, Hindi, Urdu, and the cities Calcutta, Bombay, Agra, Bareilly, Ghazipur, Banaras, etc. Praising the Asiatic Company for its commitment to knowledge and learning, Sprenger mentions of a learning expedition that the government had sent to Tibet, and that the government was paying for drawings of temples and their descriptions, and then mentions his primary task, the compilation of a bibliography of the collection in Lucknow, under contract by the British government, the central point, and Lucknow, which was at that time the central point of Islamic studies in India. Sprenger's annotated bibliography, with a record of over 1,500 works, was published in Calcutta in 1854. This is the file on Sprenger at the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin. In the introduction to his work, Sprenger gives an account of history of libraries in Awadh, their upkeep, and the modes of their maintenance. In 1857, upon his return to Germany, so he comes back to Germany in 1857. 1857 is actually in Indian history, it is the first revolt. It's called, well, the British called it the Sepoy Mutiny, the Indians call it the first revolution of or the first war of independence, or the revolt against the British government. So revolt, mutiny, revolution, there are 3 different words used for this. It was basically an uprising in northern India, and then it was crushed by the British. But it's around this time that Sprenger sort of suddenly comes back. Lucknow was already under direct control of the British at that time, but now sort of British declare after this, their supreme power in India. They become even more powerful after this so-called mutiny. But this is the time when Sprenger sort of goes away. There's a revolt happening, and he goes away with this shipment of books. There's something up with this story. Anyway, in the introduction, in 1857, upon his return to Germany, Sprenger published Bibliotheca Orientalis. Let's see if it's here. And this is, I'll come to this. A catalogue of his personal collection of manuscripts. The introduction to this volume is much better than the introduction to his earlier bibliography. Here he mentions his traveling in India, acquiring manuscripts and collecting books from everywhere, and declares that he did it not out of a childish bibliomania, but, and I quote, a sense of duty. He states, and I quote, "I admit that literature of the East has no intrinsic value. It contains a few facts, if any, and in poetry, and even in poetry and philosophy, Oriental works contain few sentiments and ideas which we can admire or would like to adopt. Nevertheless, it deserves to be cultivated." End quote. Sprenger goes on to comment on the neglect and disrespect of books by the general population in the East. From India all the way to Lebanon, he mentions the existence of, and I quote, "books not on bookshelves, but in large heaps, in trunks, where they coexist with rats. Oriental nations are no longer able to take care of their literary treasures. The duty of taking care of the patrimony of our Eastern brethren devolves upon the enlightened public of Europe, and every man who finds an opportunity ought to secure as many good books as he can." So it's, the books are here, they're brought to Europe because they can't take care of them, and so we have to do that. So this power dynamics that also exists through this colonial mercantilist enterprise. Sprenger swings like a pendulum between his praise of Oriental literature, which belongs to his collection, and the disgust for Oriental destruction of books. He goes on to say that his is the most complete of all collections, that his private library is equivalent to the best collections in Europe. But their literature doesn't mean much. And this is the measuring the world with literature that's going on with Sprenger. Anyway, Sprenger's collection now sits at the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin. It was bought in 1858, the largest purchase of its kind by any European library in the 19th century. And this particular photograph that you see is actually the report of Dr. Karl Helm, who was the director of the Staatsbibliothek in Munich. Sprenger came back from India, peddled his collection to 3 different places, first in Göttingen, then in Munich, and then to Staatsbibliothek in Berlin. And he wanted to be paid in Dutch currency, which was the strongest currency in Europe at that time, so he wanted to obviously make money off it. And he basically handled with Munich for the longest time, and then ended up selling it to Berlin. And there was this Streitschrift, as they say in Germany, this report of controversy was published by Dr. Karl Helm, saying how Sprenger cannot keep his word, and he promised this collection to Munich and he has sold it to Berlin. And this is a longer history, because both Berlin and Munich, the royal libraries, often competed for these kinds of collections, for acquisition of manuscripts. So there's a system of this vetting and acquisition that's already in place. Once we understand, now I'm getting to the last part, once we understand the role of books and libraries as social agents that catapult literary works beyond their point of national linguistic origin, the construction of world literature for the reading public becomes easier to understand. The cultural significance of access to literature through books and libraries from other parts of the world, the role of international commerce in facilitating such access, and the pedagogical implications of such access have been at the very core of world literature since Goethe's time. The inventory of world literature has been, since its inception, implicitly prospective, explicitly retrospective, and inherently interconnected with other inventories. Present in this constellated inventory is also a distinct awareness of linguistic, discursive, and material accessibility that obscures the notion of all discoverable titles from the word, classified and understood under the rubrics of literature. Scholarly works published in the last 10 years ask new questions of the very institution and institutionalization of world literature. However, the walls of the classroom, the borders of the university campus, and precincts of the conference venue have largely defined the physical and conceptual parameters of this institutionality. And I'll cite 2 examples and then move to my coda. In comparative literature, Death of a Discipline, and these are both voices come out of New York City. One is Guthrie Spivak, the other is Emily Apter. And now you can see the various centers of world literature that I saw, and this is one center, right? Quite literally. In comparative literature, The Death of a Discipline, 2003, and An Aesthetic Education in the Era of Globalization, Guthrie Spivak admonishes against the linguistic homogenization of a diverse body of literature into the target language in which the study of world literature is conducted. For Spivak, an overinvestment in access to world literature in translation erodes the linguistic and cultural differences that are woven into the fabric of literary texts. In this work, Death of a Discipline, for example, she outlines the extension of literary comparison to understand the highly intense and politicized interactions between nations and origins. So, this is one of the quotes. She says, "If we seek to supplant gender training and human rights intervention by expanding the scope of comparative literature, the proper study of literature may give us entry to the performativity of culture as instantiated in the narrative." And what I'm questioning is, what is this proper study of literature, and whether it can happen in translation. So, Spivak's, and this is the second quote, "The old comparative literature did not ask the student to learn every hegemonic language, nor will the new ask her or him to learn all the subaltern ones." Okay. So on the one hand, translation becomes significant to this kind of comparison, and translation both in the sense of, bearing across a set of vocabularies and syntax from one linguistic cultural space to another. But on the other hand, a figurative translation, she determines, must be carried out through access in original languages. The challenge that Spivak emphasizes, and rightly so, both within the disciplines of comparative literature and within literary studies in general, is the one in which, in confrontation with widespread ignorance among scholars and graduate students of comparative literature, especially in non-European languages, would provide reason and recourse for a rejuvenation or a reincarnation of the discipline of comparative literature that she declares dead. But her rightful insistence on the reason for a less nationally frightened and more globally enthused curiosity for literary works in the so-called less commonly taught languages is weakened by her overestimation of the relationship between academic and non-academic readings of world literature. And this, I'm not going to get into the details, but this sort of continues in another essay that she has recently published, and this is called States of World Literature in this collection called An Aesthetic Education in the Era of Globalization. And here too, more or less she demonstrates how the idea focuses not so much on circulation, but on the essay focuses not so much on circulation, but on the idea of access and translation. And she thinks that access and translation actually creates certain literary hierarchies. To what extent are these literary hierarchies created is something that I'm trying to sort of question, and whether they're only created in a classroom, or is there another set that happens outside of the classroom situation. That's what I'm concentrating on. Continuing, more recently in Against World Literature, and this is directly connected to pedagogy, Emily Apter seeks to challenge the singularity of world literature by privileging the plurality, world literatures, cautioning at the same time against the danger posed to the diversity of comparative literature caused by the neglect of untranslatability. In the introduction to the book, Apter states, and I quote, "I have been left uneasy in the face of the entrepreneurial, bulimic drive to anthologize and curricularize the world's cultural resources as evidenced in projects sponsored by some proponents of world literature," end quotes. So, promising to reactivate untranslatability as a theoretical fulcrum of comparative literature, Apter proposes a partnering of translation theory as Weltliteratur, which would challenge flaccid globalisms that paid lip service to alterity while doing little more than to buttress neoliberal big tent syllabi taught in English. Let me spell out 3 lines of thought that mark these two positions. First, there exists an uneasy relationship within access to literature solely in translation, especially in dominant languages of European descent. Second, and immediately related to the first concern, is the question of specialized training of readers within the university. World literature seeks to compromise, even obstruct or render superfluous the proactive acquisition of second, third, or fourth languages. The discovery of world literature as a site for global comparativity is always plagued by literary propriety and linguistic mastery of experts who discuss it as such. And finally, there is a heightened awareness of and cynicism towards the growing market for literature in translation, as well as scholarly publications of world literature. In sum, Spivak and Apter derive their energy from the conceptual proposals of Goethe and carry the legacy of the pedagogical anxieties of Auerbach with a passing or unreasonably inadequate, I would say, acknowledgement of Karl Marx. Recent or archaic, singular or plural, permanent or ephemeral, homogenizing or heterogenizing, disciplined or undisciplined, comparative or assimilative. World literature, as I imagine it, is not a choice between these binaries. It is in fact the productive tension between these binaries that gives world literature its many contested meanings, which in fact are in turn historically constructed, culturally located, and politically charged. It would indeed be unreflective to override political histories with intellectual or literary histories, or find simple overlaps between economic histories and the creation of a world literary space for the public. However, it would be equally unreflective to believe that the literary sphere is constantly in the mode of unfastening itself from the economic and political spheres, that there is a greater imagined autonomy towards which literature strives to, regardless of its qualification as local, national, or world, strives to achieve at a distance from the immediate milieu in which it is created. The challenge lies in scrutinizing ways in which the patrimony of a given national and political literary prestige actually underwrites or subsidizes the way for works from other literary spheres to enter the larger world literary space. The challenge lies in relearning how through habits and practices of reading, translated works become alibis for cultural nativism, cultural relativism, cultural pluralism, and as the history of colonialism reflects, cultural subjugation. The challenge lies in investigation how translations did not impede the idea of world literature. In fact, they simultaneously formed the very foundation of imagination of world literature and of global literary comparison. Last part. In his rich commentary on circulation in pre-modern world, César Dominguez succinctly observes, literary works, and I'm quoting, literary works do not circulate by themselves in an aesthetic vacuum. Otherwise, circulation will be at best an empty and metaphorical signifier which dangerously resonates with traditional definitions of classics or masterpieces as works that circulate through time. To illustrate this point, he offers three important factors crucial for circulation: historical context, agency, and physicality. Dominguez's thoughts are pertinent even in the context of modern world literary circulation. And this is one thing that I've tried to show with my discussion of both the Oriental Translation Fund, the Deutsche Morgenländische Gesellschaft, and Alois Sprenger. World literature, if it is to find relevance for us in the 21st century, needs to be understood in the larger public life of literature, beyond the university classroom, beyond a specialized community of readers. And one way to achieve this goal would be to locate world literature in the larger history of media dissemination. The history of construction of world literature is a history of global media dissemination, whereby interactive and not isolationist national political histories have created an interactive cultural space which operated sometimes in alliance with and at other times in defiance of the national political space. The ultimate question lies not in tracing the proliferation or circulation of world literature merely as a form of reading or as a discourse of academic experts in the new century. The challenge lies in tracing a new genealogy of world literature, whereby along with conceptual dimensions, socio-political, commercial, and cultural factors have contributed to the establishment of world literature as a public sphere institution. Rethinking world literature for the 21st century means to change the framework of asking what constitutes world literature, that is, confronting the very question of how the discourse of masterpieces overwhelmed the construction of world literature from the outset. And to embrace this challenge, I propose a genealogy of world literature that shifts the focus from presentist academic concerns in professionalized forms of reading or in pan-geographical projections of a world republic of letters with one nation, one language at its center, where indeed one size fits all one size fits all nations and publics. And to make world literature studies relevant for us in the 21st century requires of us to locate world literature in the public sphere, where it's institutionalized in ways that corresponds to, but not necessarily overlaps with, its modes of institutionalizations at the university. Weltliteratur, world literature, Vishwa Sahitya, Dunya Adibiyati, Literatura Mundial, Literatura del Mundo. The story of world del mundo. The story of world literature is not a single story. It comprises multiple stories of difference in comparison, acquisition and appropriation, inhabitation and naturalization. World literature is less about ownership and expertise and more about access to and familiarity with that which is not one's own through the accident of birth and naturalness of a mother tongue. World literature, for me, is ultimately about borrowing privileges. As reader of world literature, whether in the classroom or outside, we borrow privileges of accessing a world outside our immediate identitarian markers of linguistic and cultural origins. The task of translation, much maligned in today's world literary discussion, does not end with the translator. As my earlier examples of Joyce in China, Pamuk in India, Murakami in the USA demonstrate, the task of a translator continues with the readers. By accessing works in translation, we interrupt our habits of reading works created in our mother tongues, transform the meanings of texts that originated elsewhere. World literature is the task of a reader in translation who then becomes a translated reader. A reader of world literature is a translated reader who borrows privileges in someone else's inheritance, who knows how to unpack someone else's libraries. I thank you all for your attention.